Welcome back to Combat Mission Cold War, where we're going to take a look at the armoured workhorse of the US Army in this period, the M60 tank. A little bit of the history behind it, its core characteristics in combat mission, the different variants, and how to get the most out of it in-game. As usual with the American kit, this video is brought to you by the letter M. The M60 is frequently referred to as the M60 pattern. This can get a bit confusing because there is also an M48 pattern, an M47 pattern, and an M46 pattern. But the common name reflects the developmental history of the first generation of US main battle tanks. In the beginning, there was the M26 Pershing, first produced in 1944. This was a US heavy tank that saw limited combat at the very end of World War II, though one was famously filmed engaging a Panther in the streets of Cologne. The M26 had some issues though, and these were addressed after the war by installing a new, more powerful engine and upgrading the 90mm gun. The tweaked version was designated the M46 pattern, which started rolling off the production lines in 1949. The M46 was supposed to be a stopgap solution until a brand new design was developed to replace the US tank fleet. But as the Cold War started to bite, fears of the vast and rapidly developing Soviet tank arm forced the US to focus on improving the M46 instead of waiting, perfect being the enemy of good enough. So we have a solution in the early 1950s where the US Army is exploring new tank designs and building prototypes, but inevitably abandoning those programs and applying their useful developments to its existing vehicles. In broad, simple terms, the M47 was created by taking an M46 and fitting it with the improved turret from the T-42 program. Then, the T-48 program came along, which made some substantial changes to the hull, including deleting the bow gunner and decreasing the crew from 5 to 4, moving the driver to a central position flanked by ammunition storage, plus changing the turret to a more rounded hemispherical shape to remove the shot traps of the T-42 turret. This was called the M48, which went through several more upgrades in its lifespan. The real drive for the next change came from the Hungarian uprising in 1956, where the British military attaché in Budapest, then Lieutenant Colonel Noel Cowley, was able to collect information on brand new Soviet T-54s captured or knocked out in the street fighting. The T-54's new 100mm gun concerned the US Army, which immediately began looking for an upgrade to the 90mm gun on its own M48. After trials, the British 105mm L7 gun was selected and incorporated into the M48's turret, while at the same time the armour thickness was increased and the edge of the front hull changed from a rounded shape to a sharp edge, with the suspension altered to cope with increased weight. The result was the M60, which began production in 1959. So once again, instead of the new tank design it really wants, the US Army is turning to a stopgap as it tries to close the perceived tank gap with the Soviets. This has consequences. Like its forebears, the M60 is rushed into production and suffers a great many teething problems. These are mostly addressed with the A1 variant, which is where we start in Combat Mission Cold War. The most obvious visual change in the first upgrade is the move from the M48's rounded turret to the needle-nosed turret, which sets the M60's distinctive appearance for the remainder of the Cold War. Incremental improvements continued throughout the M60's service with the US Army, leading to various M60A1 upgrades, the ATGM-focused offshoot of the M60A2, and then a return to the 105mm cannon with the M60A3, before the Army finally realised its brand new tank design in the form of the M1 Abrams, which entered production in 1979. In other words, US tank development from 1945 to 1980 can easily be argued to be stopgaps all the way down, and despite all the upgrades, the M60 is at its core a World War II design. A byproduct of that design, though, was that it had a lot of internal space to fit in new equipment, giving it a lot of room to improve as new technology became available. The final variant in Combat Mission Cold War, the M60 A3TDS, features thermal optics, a laser rangefinder, and depleted uranium armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot rounds that allow it to remain very competitive despite its origins. Over 15,000 variants of all types were ultimately produced. In US service, the M60 never fought on its intended Cold War battlefields, but a couple of early engineering variants did make it to Vietnam, and the US Marines took some to Grenada and Beirut before successfully clashing with Iraqi armour in Desert Storm. Outside of US service, the M60 has seen extensive combat with the Israelis in the Middle East, the Iranians, of all people, in the Iran-Iraq War, and it remains in service with even more upgrades amongst US allies across the world, to the point that recently Turkish M60s have been fighting in northern Syria. That's a quick, shallow overview of the M60's development and history. There is, of course, much more out there in more depth if you want to look for it, including a history by R.P. Honeycutt, but the real question is, how does all this translate into Combat Mission Cold War? As usual, we're going to take a look at the M60's mobility, protection, and firepower, plus a few of the other less obvious elements that can be surprisingly important. For this, we're going to use the in-game base model, the M60A1, and then expand on these characteristics as they change when we get to the variants. Mobility is always hard to pin down in Combat Mission. In terms of raw data, we can say the M60 can do about 620 meters in a minute on road, and about 480 on grass, assuming the ground is flat and dry, providing the M60 is using the fast command, and it's going in a straight line from a standing start. The number of times you will encounter those specific conditions in game is going to be pretty low, so it's not tremendously useful. As always, if you really need to know if your unit can get from point A to point B within a certain time frame, it's best to go into the editor and just test it. There isn't anything stand out about the M60's mobility that I've noticed so far, either good or bad. Probably the most important aspect to be aware of is the relative speed between the M60 and the M113. The M113 is considerably faster than the M60 both on and off road, which is something to bear in mind if you're wanting to coordinate your armour and infantry effectively. As opposed to mobility, protection is something that is pretty easy to test. At 1000 meters, the M60 is entirely vulnerable to the 100mm gun on the T55. At 2000 meters, the T55's heat shells will burn through, but its APDS shells won't. This isn't a tremendous amount of comfort. When I was testing, the tech AI for the T55s only switched to APDS once they were out of heat. The T-55 is the earliest Soviet tank in-game with the worst ammunition and the smallest caliber main gun at 100mm. The T-55A, with armor-piercing fin-stabilized discarding sabot ammunition instead of APDS, still fails to penetrate, but the next Soviet tank up the chain, the T-62, with the 110mm gun, has no problems whatsoever. Again, down at the bottom of the Soviet barrel, the AT-3 Saga ATGM has no problems penetrating the M60A1 from the front, and even the heat rounds from the BMP's 73mm gun are capable of scoring partial penetrations on the frontal armour. These 73mm rounds, along with smaller handheld AT weapons, aren't necessarily going to do significant damage unless they hit something important, like crew, ammunition, fuel, or subsystem components, but they are still getting through the armour. In other words, the M60 can be knocked out by pretty much any anti-tank weapon is likely to come up against. This is mostly to do with the steel armour. Although composite add-on armour that would decrease the effectiveness of heat warheads was considered in the design stage, it was ultimately considered too expensive to be rolled out. Compounding this vulnerability is the size of the tank. The M60 is a very tall vehicle. This has advantages, but it does make it a large target. The other side of the coin, of course, is the M60's ability to dish out rather than receive punishment. This could get quite complicated because although the main gun of the M60 never changes, except for the Starship, but that's just weird, the type of ammunition does change several times over the variants. So this segment on the main gun specifically relates to the M60A1 and its performance against selected Soviet tanks. This performance will improve with improved ammunition that we'll go over with the variants as we get to them. The A1's M456A1 heat and M728 APDS ammunition will punch holes in both the T55 and T62 out to 2,000 meters, but after these two tanks they start to struggle. In their frontal arcs, the T64, T72 and T80 will shrug off both of these rounds even as close as 500 meters, except in the lower front hull and one or two very small weak points in the armor scheme, such as the weapon mount. Outside of the frontal arcs of the later Soviet tanks though, the M60A1 easily scores penetrations out to the whole 2 kilometers. So clearly, hitting Soviet armor from the flank is going to yield much better results than trying to go at them head on. Noticeably, the M60A1 carries no 105mm high explosive ammunition, instead relying on its heat shells against infantry. They're not as effective against troops, soft targets and buildings as straight high explosive, but they get the job done and reflect the M60's primary role as a tank that fights other tanks, rather than an instrument for rooting out enemy infantry. It also carries some white phosphorus rounds. These are for laying smoke using the target smoke command, rather than engaging enemy infantry, because they're just not very good at it. In terms of range finding and fire control, the M60 is equipped with an optical coincidence rangefinder. You can see the 2 lenses poking out on either side of the turret. This gives the gunner 2 images, and by tweaking his controls until those images merge, he can determine the range to the target. This is more accurate than using the reticle in his optic to guesstimate, but it still requires a degree of skill and is susceptible to user fatigue that later laser rangefinding equipment does away with. The data from the rangefinder goes into a mechanical fire control computer, which provides the data the gunner needs to get rounds on target. A regular crew may still need a few shots before they manage to make a connection at long range, but it's much better than unassisted trial and error. In a similar vein, while the M60A1 does have a stabilizer and can fire on the move, we're not dealing with the same kind of stabilization as a modern tank, and accuracy does very noticeably drop off once the tank starts moving. Aside from the 105mm main gun, the M60A1 is also equipped with a 7.62mm coaxial machine gun and a 50 caliber machine gun mounted in the commander's distinctive cupola. Overall, the M60 carries 23 heat, 35 APDS and 5 white phosphorus rounds for the main gun, spread between storage in the back left of the turret and on either side of the driver, plus 900 rounds of 50 caliber armor-piercing incendiary for the commander's NG, and more than 5,000 rounds of 7.62mm for the coax. That's the firepower rounded up. In terms of other elements, the M60 has a crew of 4. The driver is located centrally in the hull, the gunner on the right of the turret with the commander behind him, then the loader on the left of the turret in what is the pretty conventional internal layout for US tanks. All the crew positions have their own hatches except the gunner, who has to follow the commander up out through the cupola. The M60A1 does have some early night vision equipment, given away by the gigantic infrared searchlight mounted above the main gun. It's not clear when units in combat mission actually use active infrared or how much that gives away their position, but in any case this is early night fighting kit. It's not tremendously effective, and it does not come with any guarantee that the M60 will actually spot anything in the dark. That's a brief overview of the characteristics of the M60A1. Now it's time for the variants. The M60A1 has 3 upgrades modelled in-game. The M60A1 Rise, the M60A1 Rise Plus, and the M60A1 Rise Passive, which are incremental upgrades of the A1. Then there is the M60A2 Starship, which branches off in a totally different direction. And finally the M60A3 and the M60A3 TTS, which represent another step up from the A1 to get a shiny new number. RISE stands for Reliability Improved Selected Equipment, and is an upgrade package that's part of the US Army's process of ironing out the M60's teething problems. Introduced in 1975, the M60A1 RISE included a series of improvements to the engine and transmission that don't have a lot of impact in combat mission terms, but did also include the 1972 AOS, or Add-on Stabilization upgrade, that greatly improves the A1's accuracy on the move. The only difference in the in-game model for the RISE compared to the A1 is that the Xenon searchlight is now uncovered. Next up, we have the M60A1 Rise Plus, which has some new ammunition. The M735 armor-piercing, fin-stabilized discarding sabot round. Functionally, in combat mission, the M735 is a big step forward in accuracy, but while the penetration value has substantially increased, going from up to 250mm of rolled homogeneous armor equivalent to up to 410mm, the frontal armor of the tougher Soviet tanks that the A1 was struggling with to begin with is still very effective. So realistically, although the Rise Plus does have a better AP round, it's still best to try and get those flanking shots in. As far as I can tell, there is no difference at all between the models for the Rise and Rise Plus variants. This makes sense because the differences between them are internal, but good luck figuring out which one it is if you're on the other side. Finally, for the A1s, we have the Rise Passive. This variant upgrades the optics for the gunner and the commander to include passive night sights. These are a significant step forward over the active night sights used by the variants up to this point, because they don't involve turning on a huge infrared searchlight and showing everybody else with night vision equipment where you are. In game, it's very difficult to test what kind of difference this makes to spotting at night, but it should be better. More practical is the addition of a pair of smoke launchers to the turret. This allows the Rise Passive to pop smoke. The launchers have two charges, which will create a smoke screen in a forward-facing arc about 30 meters ahead of the vehicle. The smoke takes a little while to deploy, and the M60 is pretty tall, so it's not like popping smoke will immediately hide it. Those smoke launchers are the easiest, and probably the only way, to tell the Rise Passive from the other three A1 variants in combat mission. After the M60A1, we have an interesting interlude, the M60A2 Starship. In the mid-60s, there was some concern about whether anti-tank guided missiles would take over from high-velocity tank cannons, so, in keeping with the M60's development history, instead of waiting to the BM-8 program to produce a brand new tank, an interim vehicle was produced to fill the perceived capability gap. This was the M60A2, which essentially replaced the M60A1's turret with one built around a 155mm low-velocity gun, capable of firing MGM-51 Shillelagh ATGMs as well as conventional heat and high-explosive rounds. It was cutting edge for its time, but unfortunately one of the problems of being at the cutting edge of technology is that the technology is frequently immature. As such, the A2 suffered a lot of reliability problems involving its advanced electronics and the Shillelagh missiles, and although it entered service in 1972, only about 500 were built and it was out of service by 1982. Most of the A2s were converted back into more conventional variants by simply replacing the fancy Starship turret, with the remainder being converted into various armoured engineer vehicles. In combat mission, we don't really need to worry too much about mechanical reliability, and the M60A2 functions essentially as intended. Unfortunately, it doesn't particularly stand out from the A1. The Shillelagh version used in combat mission Cold War is the MGM-51A, with a 2,000 meter maximum range, and using a wire-guided SACLOS guidance system. This means that the gunner must keep his crosshairs on target to guide the missile, during which time the M60A2 cannot move. This is not ideal because, like most ATGMs, the Shillelagh travels considerably slower than high-velocity tank rounds, and it is entirely possible that the intended recipient will spot the launch and destroy the A2 before the missile can reach it. In terms of effects on target, the Shillelagh is also somewhat underwhelming. Similar to the kinetic energy rounds from the 105mm gun, it struggles with the frontal upper hull and turret armour of Soviet tanks from the T-64 upwards. The heat rounds from the 152mm gun also suffer the same problem. You're still trying to hit the enemy's side or rear armour, which somewhat defies the point of having the A2 over the A1. On the plus side, the A2 is the first M60 to be fitted with a laser rangefinder, so it's not as inaccurate with those low-velocity 152mm shells as it could be, and it does have a pure high-explosive shell for anti-infantry or anti-structure work, which is considerably more effective than the 105mm heat shells used by the other M60s. The turret, being a different design, does generally have thicker armour than the A1, and the generally more rounded shape does give better general ballistic protection. While this can make the Starships seem a bit tougher, especially against non-heat ammunition at longer ranges, it's not something to rely on. As always, avoiding getting hit in the first place is the best defense. The next variant is the M60A3, which took the M60A1 with all its rise upgrades and updated it to remain competitive into the 1980s. The two main improvements are, firstly, the replacement of the visual rangefinder and mechanical ballistic computer with a new fire control system incorporating a laser rangefinder and an electronic fire control computer. The second major improvement in combat mission terms is another upgrade in ammunition. The earlier M735 round has been swapped out for the M774 APFSDS, which, amongst other improvements, signals a shift from a tungsten alloy penetrator to a depleted uranium one. Depleted uranium has two significant advantages over tungsten in armor-piercing capability. Firstly, when striking armor, it undergoes adiabatic shear, meaning that instead of flattening, it fractures in such a way as to retain a sharp edge. And it is pyrophoric, meaning that the shaved off dust and fragments of depleted uranium produced as it shears on contact will spontaneously ignite. To put it another way, depleted uranium ammunition is both self-sharpening and incendiary. This improved capability is bad news for the T-72 variants in-game inside 1000 meters, but the T-64s and T-80s with their heavier composite armor are a bit tougher, and while the M774 can penetrate the frontal turret and upper hull at 500 meters, it doesn't do so reliably. More impressive than the ammunition is the increased accuracy provided by the new rangefinder and fire control system. First round hits are much more likely, even at long ranges, reducing the need to stay in view of the enemy plugging away with shots until they get on target. There are some other minor changes. The turret thickness has been increased, and a halon firefighting system added, which should, in theory, improve crew survivability. The easiest way to recognise the M60A3 variant is that it is missing the huge infrared searchlight mounted above the gun mantlet, but they do also have a thermal shroud around the 105mm gun. This is to help minimise temperature changes in the barrel that can affect the weapon's accuracy. The final M60 variant in Combat Mission Cold War is the M60A3 TTS. This is simply an A3 fitted with a Raytheon tank thermal sight. This is a very significant upgrade because it allows the gunner to spot and engage targets through smoke, dust, and in conditions of low visibility relating to time of day and weather. This means that the A3 TTS is not going to be blinded by Soviet smoke, whether that is delivered by artillery or popped by vehicles, and it's not going to be blinded by the dust thrown up by artillery bombardments. Soviet tanks and ATGM teams, on the other hand, do not have a corresponding thermal capability in this period, so use of smoke by any side could potentially turn the battlefield into a very one-sided shooting range dominated by A3 TTSs. In terms of recognition, in-game, the M60A3 TTS is indistinguishable from the M60A3, which is really bad news for Soviet players because you're only going to find out it can see you through the smoke the hard way. That's the variants dealt with. What's the best way to use the M60 in Combat Mission Cold War? How do you get the most out of it? If we look at the ammunition, we have a pretty clear role. Sure, the heat rounds double up as anti-infantry or anti-structure rounds, but like the APDS or APFSDS rounds, they're primarily for anti-tank or anti-vehicle work. Even so, all variants of the M60 are going to struggle against the frontal upper hull and turret armour of the heavier Soviet tanks, while having armour that really can't be relied on in any circumstances. So the trick with the M60 is to focus on enemy vehicles and avoid head-on confrontations. Choosing good kill zones or fire sacks and setting up so that if the enemy is head-on to one position, he is flanked by another is a good way forward, as is making sure to minimise exposure by conducting fire ambushes. The M60s stay turret down, then pop up to hull down at the right moment, quickly engage the enemy and then reverse back into cover, from where they can shift to alternate positions, ready to rinse and repeat. The emphasis is on minimising exposure, keeping the enemy guessing, and inflicting maximum damage without becoming committed to an extended tank duel. It's all about using the terrain to control the terms of the engagement. You don't want to get backed into a corner where you have to slug it out on the enemy's terms. It's also worth bearing in mind that while the M60 can struggle against the front of some Soviet tanks, it has no problems whatsoever destroying BTRs and BMPs. Tanks need infantry support, especially if they're going to be operating in dense terrain, so focusing on enemy APCs and IFBs to either destroy their infantry or force them to walk everywhere is going to massively undercut enemy capabilities. Fundamentally though, the best way I think to conceptualize the M60 is as a World War II tank with post-war capabilities. It's relatively mobile, the gun is good but not quite good enough to tackle heavier enemy tanks on the front, its armour is nothing to write home about, and unless it's the A3 TTS, it's relying on unenhanced optics to spot targets. It's a very capable vehicle, but it has its limitations, and the trick is to work around them. So, that's a quick look at the M60 variants in Combat Mission Cold War. If you're fighting any battle with armour, chances are you're going to be fighting with or against it, so hopefully this rundown of its capabilities and variants is going to help out. I'll see you in the next video.